Growing up, there were two games that really resonated with me a lot, but I never really understood why. Sure, the combat was awesome, I sort of understood the story, and there was a bunch of cool characters from games and movies that I love, but there was almost like there was something else. Something that left an impact on me and many others. Something I never really understood. The two magical games I'm talking about are Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2, a game franchise I'm sure most people watching this video are probably familiar with, and a game franchise most people watching this video can probably tell I hold very close to heart. No pun intended. Kingdom Hearts is very special to me, partly because it feels like a little part of my childhood that only me and a few people around the world got to share. So finally, with the release of Kingdom Hearts 3, I was hoping that I would possibly be able to go back and get that feeling of sweet nostalgia and childhood wonder that I've been craving after 14 years of waiting. At least that was what I was hoping for, because by the end of Kingdom Hearts 3, I could not help but feel very disappointed. A game that was supposed to feel like a nostalgia trip back to more innocent and pure time, instead ended up feeling like a forced, passionless shell of what it used to be. But even though there's a lot about this game that I don't like, I don't necessarily think it's a bad game. It's just underwhelming. KH3 gets a lot of stuff right. The gameplay for the most part is more dynamic than it's ever been. They did a wonderful job keeping all the charm of the old combat system, but also building on it in a great way. There are new summon spells, new party attacks, new party members that also have their own party attacks, attraction attacks, flow motion attacks, and my personal favorite, the new addition of Keyblade transformations that replace the old drive forms from KH2, which is a great idea that makes it genuinely exciting to see what your new Keyblade could do after you completed the world. Unexpectedly, the only form that they did keep, and just so happened to be my favorite, is the anti-form that you sometimes go into when your HP gets very low, which makes for some awesome butt clenching moments when you're trying your hardest to win the fight, but not to take too much damage, since you can't heal. Another unexpected thing that actually really surprised me about KH3 is that Gummy Ship missions are actually kinda cool now. Yeah, you can actually fly in this kinda open world now instead of it being on rails. There's not a lot to see other than a crap ton of asteroids and some cool light tunnels here and there, but being able to actually fly to different worlds is a pretty cool and interesting idea. Now don't get me wrong, the Gummy Ship battles still suck and are basically just a test of how long you can hold down a button while dodging some attacks here and there, but it's still a welcoming change when you compare it to the old Gummy missions. Parts of why this works is because of how beautiful the graphics are. The game at times looks stunning, and Square Enix really did an amazing job mixing the different styles of Disney and Final Fantasy, whilst also pushing the limits of the Unreal Engine 4. Although I still prefer the old style, I thought I was gonna hate how all the non-Disney characters would look, but throughout my time of playing, the new style actually grew on me a lot. Now, hands down, my favorite part about this game is the music. I think no matter how much you dislike Kingdom Hearts, one thing that everyone can agree on is how good the music is. I mean, just listen to this. There's not a single moment in this game where I'm not in total awe about how fantastic the soundtrack is. My only gripe being that I would like some variation in some worlds, but overall, I have to say they really outdid themselves, and I personally feel like we should all take a moment to give a single clap to Square for this. Oh, that was moist. Well, they better enjoy that. Are you kidding me, dude? I'm getting trolled by this bird. Well, they better enjoy that because that's kind of where the positives end for me. As I mentioned, KH3 pretty much nails the combat and graphics, but if you ask me, that really isn't enough to make a game stand among the great these days. For a game to be truly considered great, and especially for a big sequel like this, you need to be able to push the boundaries of all those that came before it. And KH3, in my opinion, had that potential, but basically threw it out the window. Let me explain why. My number one gripe with KH3 is the lack of experimentation it took in making the worlds. This game suffers greatly from what I like to call fear of change mentality, meaning that once you find a formula that works for you, you never do anything to try to change it, even 17 years after you made it. Let's compare some of the Zelda games to the Kingdom Hearts games, specifically Ocarina of Time and Breath of the Wild. Both of these games are very similar, but you can obviously tell there's a very big difference in how they play. One thing that I will always applaud Zelda games for is in every game they change the recipe but always keep the same core ingredients that make it great. The story is almost always the same, cool guy Link saving the world from evil character Ganon whilst involving Zelda in some way. And this would get boring if every Zelda game had the same gameplay, but they don't. Each game they always change the process in which you play through the scenario. Now even though these are very different games, I still believe KH can learn a lot from this formula. In Kingdom Hearts there are 7 games, cause I'm not going to include the mobile game in this. And in each game, they never once change how the world system works. Sure, there are some games that change it a little bit, like Chain of Memories, but for the most part it's always been that you travel to a world, stop the darkness, then you're off to another world, which I don't mind. It's just that you expect them to somehow change something about the system so it doesn't get stale. But this is where the fear of change mentality kicks in. In KH3, it's the exact same formula as every other game. No change, nothing. This would have been a perfect opportunity going from a system like the 3DS to a far more powerful system like the PS4 to introduce a big change. One thing that I would love to see is bigger worlds. I mean, how dope wouldn't it be to be able to experience the journey from Andy's room to the toy store? Instead, you simply walk out in the street and boom, cutscene, you're at the toy store. At no point in the game, other than when you're looking at the graphics, does it feel like they're actually using the power of the PS4. The worlds are almost exactly as big as they are in Kingdom Hearts 2, a game released 14 years ago. But okay, you would assume since the worlds are basically just as big as they are in KH2, they would instead add more of them to the game. Okay, I mean, I would rather them spend more time making good and entertaining worlds than for them to spend more time making boring and uninspired ones. Except most of the worlds in this game are not good or entertaining. Almost every world in KH3 suffers from that they either drag on for far too long or they feel like they were put together last minute. Now I did say almost every world. I personally feel that Olympus and Corona for the most part are pretty decent. Especially Olympus that has some of the most beautiful scenery and one of the best boss fights in the game. Which honestly isn't hard to beat, but we'll get to that in a second. On the other hand, you have worlds like Arendelle that sadly feel like the most uninspired retelling of the Frozen movie I can think of. There's so many amazing things you could do with Arendelle, but instead they went with the most safe and boring game and world design I can think of. Which honestly sucks since I love Frozen and it was one of the worlds I was looking forward to the most. Also, all worlds have really bad stories, and I mean really bad. Even for Kingdom Hearts, which story I mostly enjoy, even though at times it can be really stupid, this is honestly a new low. Here's pretty much how every world goes. You go there, there's always someone from the org that shows up, they shit talk you a little, then cause some chaos, and at the end they summon some generic boss and peace out. It literally feels like you're getting blue-balled by every single world. I understand that they were trying to build up to the end of the game when you face all of the organization, but this is not how you do it. Having to fight some generic ass boss by the end of every world is like getting a PS4 for Christmas, only to find out that you can only play Sonic Forces on it. Before making this video, I honestly couldn't remember a single boss fight that takes place before the end of the game, other than the Titans and Xehanort. Meanwhile, KH1 have some of the most memorable boss fights like Genie Jafar and Cerberus. It's like they forgot that this game takes place in a universe filled with Disney characters. There's literally so many cool characters you could have used for a bad guy, but again they went with the most generic and boring option they can think of. I mentioned near the start that I don't mind the combat in this game. In fact, I actually like it. I don't think that every move in your disposal is that good, but I respect the fact that there's options. One thing that I don't like though is how forced some mechanics are. Take the attractions, you have these through most of the game and almost never would I found myself actually using them. Main reason being that all of them except Splash Run suffer from feeling really slow and boring when you compare it to the new and more flashy combat. Also, I get that these are based on actual rides from Disneyland, but why are these even in here? At no point do they explain how Sora suddenly has the power to summon different rides after he supposedly lost all his powers in the last game. Attraction sadly isn't the only new mechanic that feels shoved in here for no apparent reason but to add more to the game. There are a bunch more like the robots in Toy Box that are basically Blaster Blaze 2.0 and the pirate ships in Pirate World. There are definitely some that I don't mind and aren't half bad, but my main complaint being that, as I said, most of these new mechanics just feel forced. One thing that I do mind though is all the stupid missions you have to do in this game. I kid you not, there's an actual point in this game where you have to collect 300 crabs. Are you serious? Can you figure out something more fun to do? Most missions in this game just feel like glorified chores. Most notable being the 300 crab one and one where you have to search an area for parts of Olaf so you can rebuild them. Excuse me my dude, but you do understand I'm trying to stop a guy from literally destroying the world. How do you have time to go around building snowmen? I honestly don't understand what they were trying to do with this game. It's like the people responsible for the gameplay and story were told totally different things. One tries to build up anticipation for the ending, whilst the other one wants you to go around building fucking snowmen. Now, for the ending of the game, the event that they've been building up for through the whole journey. How does it fare? It's actually pretty good. From the moment you enter the Keyblade graveyard, it feels real, and it really hits you that this is the final frontier. It starts off with a fight against a horde of Heartless that is amazingly done, and it's one of the 2 times where the attractions actually really shine. There's another fight against them later on in the world as well, where the fight itself is pretty uneventful, but it's immediately negated by a section where Sora freaking rides a bunch of Keyblades into a literal vortex of Heartless, which is just fucking awesome. After that, the game finally lets you fight all the members of the organization that it's been hyping you up for throughout the entire game. Which was done in a pretty clunky way in my opinion, but I'm not going to complain anymore since it does actually make for some really cool fights. Even though a lot of the story here was definitely shoved in for the sake of convenience. But yeah, for the most part I think the ending section of the game was done pretty well. Although I have 2 main issues, the Fragment World and the actual last boss fight. Let's start with the Fragment World. There are kind of 2 parts here. The first where you have to go around collecting different versions of Sora, and the second where you have to fight this ghost thingy in every world you've been to, so you can save your friends. The second part I don't mind at all. I think it makes sense that it's here and it doesn't take away from anything. It also immediately reminded me of the part near the end of Kingdom Hearts 1 where you have to do pretty much the exact same thing, except you're not saving anyone. The first part however is where I have my problems. This is exactly like the 300 crabs in the Pirate World, just 10 times worse. When I was collecting those crabs, yeah I thought it was annoying and boring, but I never felt like I was getting ripped away from some action. This however is different. As I mentioned, from the moment you land in the Keyblade graveyard, it's action on action on action, and then suddenly the game just throws at you this slow and boring part that really takes away from the overall experience. It's like watching the end of the first Avengers movie when they're all fighting the aliens, only for them to cut away for 10 minutes in the middle of the action just to see Loki getting up after getting slammed by the Hulk and taking the elevator down from the tower. They could have easily had all the story elements from here in a single cutscene and it would have been 10 times better. Now, for the final boss. Xehanort has been a long time villain of the series and he's been made out to be the ultimate bad guy. And if you're unfamiliar with the franchise, both Xemnas and Ansem are final bosses of Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2, and they're also basically different versions of Xehanort. KH1 and 2 both have some crazy ass last boss fights, and I mean absolutely crazy. These look like they've been ripped straight out of Berserk, so you can definitely tell that someone from the Final Fantasy team worked on these. So you would expect Xehanort, the guy responsible for both Xemnas and Ansem, and it's basically a fusion between them, to have some crazy ass boss fight. But nope, sadly it doesn't. This fight is the definition of plain. It starts out in Scala et Caelum, where there are a bunch of clones of him in armor that you have to bring down. He then goes full Inception and turns the terrain on its side, so you have to fight him again. Okay, pretty standard so far, but it's after this phase it takes a turn for the worse. He once again turns the world, but now he makes it a underwater fight. Which for the people that don't know, is pretty much an actual watered down version of the normal combat. I have no idea how they thought this was a good idea, but it gets worse. Cause the next phase takes place in air, which may sound cooler, but it's basically exactly the same as water combat. The rest of the fight admittedly isn't bad, but it also isn't great. This guy has been made out to be the strongest bad guy, but throughout the whole rest of the fight, he never once turns into some super scary elite super being form like Ansem. Instead, he stays pretty normal. It definitely feels like somewhere along the lines the Kingdom Hearts franchise stopped taking too much inspiration from the Final Fantasy franchise, but I'm not gonna go around starting conspiracy theories about this. Overall, I just felt like this was a pretty lackluster boss fight to end the game on. So that's for the most part my complaints about KH3. There's a lot more nitpicky stuff about the game that I could talk about, like Keyblade transformations, animations taking too long. Fuck, that's hard to say. But that's not really worth including in the video, and at the end of the day, I'm just happy we got this game at all. But I'm not sure most people working on it had as big of a passion for the franchise as they used to, seeing as how this isn't the only Kingdom Hearts game I've been disappointed by. So as I said, I don't necessarily think this is a bad game, it's just underwhelming. Thanks for watching.